She almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved. Area code she didn't recognize. The kind of call she'd learned, at 76, to let go to voicemail. Debt collectors, political surveys, the extended warranty people who somehow still had her number after 44 years at the same address. Except she didn't have that address anymore. She answered. "Mrs. Calloway?" A man's voice, careful, the way people sound when they're about to tell you something they're not sure how to say. "My name is Ray Dominguez. I'm the site foreman on the Meadowfield job. The house on Birchwood." Ellen sat down on the edge of the bed in her rented room. "We found something inside the walls," he said. "I think it belongs to you." She hadn't been back to that house in 4 months. Not since her sons told her it had been sold. Not since she'd packed 44 years into 11 boxes and watched a gravel truck pull away down a street she'd walked every morning for longer than either of her sons had been alive. She almost asked him what he'd found. She already knew. Thomas had always said, "The house remembers everything you put into it." She'd thought it was just something he said. Thomas Calloway built the house on Birchwood Lane in 1979 with money he'd saved for 6 years and help from his brother Gerald, who had died before either of Ellen's sons was born. It was not a large house. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced east so the morning light came through the window above the sink, a back porch where the railing was slightly uneven because Thomas had measured wrong the first time and corrected it himself rather than ask anyone for help. Ellen had moved in on a Saturday in April. She remembered the exact quality of the light that day, thin and bright, the kind of April light that makes everything look like a promise. She had stood in the empty kitchen and turned in a slow circle and thought, "This is where my life is going to happen." It did. 44 years, 2 sons, a garden that Thomas planted and replanted every spring, always trying new things, always willing to lose a season to an experiment. A kitchen table where they ate every meal they ever ate at home, where the boys did homework and argued about nothing, and grew up into men Ellen recognized and sometimes didn't. A bedroom where she had sat beside Thomas for 3 days straight, the February he had his first heart scare, watching him sleep, watching him breathe, learning for the first time what it felt like to be afraid of the future. The house was not a building, it was the record of everything. After Thomas died, 3 years ago, a Tuesday in October, sudden enough that she was still in some ways catching up to it, the house became something different. Not worse, exactly, just different. Heavier in some rooms, lighter in others. She would come downstairs in the morning and find herself surprised, briefly, that the kitchen was empty, that his coffee cup wasn't on the counter, that she was alone in a house built for 2. Richard had called it the situation when he brought it up the first time. "Mom, we need to talk about the situation," he'd said 6 months after the funeral. He was 47, an accountant, a man who had turned his tendency toward order into a profession and a world view. He said, the situation, the way he might have said, the deficit, a problem with a correct solution, if only you were willing to look at the numbers clearly. Ellen had told him she was fine. She was fine. She wasn't fine. Both things were true in ways that were hard to explain. She had a neighbor, Dorothy, who brought her soup on Tuesdays and argued with her about the crossword. She had her garden. She had the chair by the east window where the morning light still came in, the way it always had. She had the particular sound the house made in the wind, a low, settled creak from the northeast corner that she had slept beside for 44 years and would have known anywhere. She had all of that. What she didn't have was Thomas. But that was a different problem. That was not a problem Richard could solve. They came on a Thursday in March, both of them together, which should have told her something. Richard and Paul rarely did anything together since their father died. They arrived within 10 minutes of each other, which meant they'd coordinated, which meant it had been planned. Paul made coffee. He was the younger one, 44, a man who filled silences with action rather than words. He put cups on the table and sat down and looked at his brother. Richard opened a folder. Ellen looked at the folder. "We've been looking into options," Richard said, "and we think, Paul and I both think, that the house isn't the best situation for you anymore." There was that word again. "I'm not planning to move," Ellen said. "Mom." Richard's voice was the careful voice, the one he used when he'd already decided. "It's a large property. The maintenance costs alone are... You're in a house with 4 bedrooms by yourself. The taxes, the upkeep, it doesn't make sense." "It makes sense to me." Paul put his hand over hers. He'd always been the one who touched, who reached. When he was 7, he used to climb into her side of the bed on Saturday mornings and press his cold feet against her legs. She had never, even once, told him to stop. "We've already found a buyer," Richard said. The kitchen went quiet. "The offer came in 3 weeks ago," he said. "It's good. More than the assessed value. The buyer wants to develop the lot, so the timeline is we'd need the house cleared within 30 days. Ellen looked at her sons. "The paperwork is already signed," Richard said. "The power of attorney, the one you signed for the estate tax situation 2 years ago, it covered property decisions. Our lawyer confirmed it. I signed that for tax purposes. It covered property decisions," he said again, as if the repetition settled it. Paul was still holding her hand. She became aware of this, his hand on hers, warm, the hand of the 7-year-old who had pressed his cold feet against her and never been told to stop. She looked at the folder. She looked at the table, the same kitchen table where he'd done his homework. She looked at Richard. "Did you look in the walls before you sold it?" she asked. The question sat in the room. Richard glanced at Paul. Paul looked at Ellen. "What?" Richard said. "The walls," she said. "Did you look inside them first?" It wasn't really a question. She said it the way you say things when the answer doesn't matter anymore, when you've already understood something and you're asking out loud only so it can be heard. Neither of them answered. Richard closed the folder. If this story is touching something in you, subscribe. There are more of these. Every week, one more. She packed alone. The Sons had sent movers, a company called Bright Move, orange logo, friendly website. She called and cancelled them the morning after Richard and Paul left. Not to punish anyone, not to make a point. She simply couldn't imagine it. Strangers in the kitchen, strangers lifting Thomas's books, his coffee mugs, the particular arrangement of things on his workroom shelf that she had never once moved in 11 years because it was his arrangement and it was correct. She couldn't do it. She did it herself, over 12 days, one room at a time. She started with the living room. The books first, 4 shelves, 46 years of accumulation, some of them books she'd never opened, and some of them books she'd read so many times the spines had given up. She wrapped them in newspaper and packed them in boxes and labelled each box in her handwriting, which was neater than Thomas's had been, but not as quick. The framed photographs took a full afternoon. She sat on the floor with them, spread around her, and looked at each one before wrapping it. Not because she was memorizing them, she didn't need to, she had them already, but because each one was a door. A specific moment, a specific light, a specific version of faces she knew better than her own. Richard at 8, with his first fish. Paul at 14, looking uncomfortable in a suit. Her and Thomas at Gerald's wedding, 1981, the last photograph taken of the 3 of them together. She wrapped them carefully and put them in a box and wrote "Photographs" on the side, in letters larger than necessary. The living room first, because it was largest, and because she needed to start somewhere. Then the guest room, which had been Paul's room, which still had a faint dent in the baseboard where he'd thrown a soccer cleat at 16 and sworn, afterward, that it was already there. The main bathroom. The hallway closet, which contained, among other things, a collection of rubber bands that Thomas had been saving for no stated purpose since approximately 1993. She kept the rubber bands. She kept everything she could carry. Thomas's workroom in the basement was the hardest. She stood at the doorway for a long time before she went in. The light down there had always been particular. A single bulb on a pull chain, warm and specific, the kind of light that makes a small space feel complete. She had never spent much time in this room. It had been his, the way the east kitchen window had been hers. Not by rule, just by nature. His tools still hung on the pegboard in the arrangement he'd always kept them, each one in its place, the shadows of their outlines faintly visible where they'd been hung long enough to leave their mark on the paint. He had labeled the shadows once, years ago, with a permanent marker, so that each tool, returned to its hook, lined up precisely with its own silhouette. She had teased him about it. He had said, without defensiveness, "That way I always know if something's missing." She took the hammer. She took the level. She took the small wooden box he'd built for his drill bits, which had his initials carved into the lid in letters slightly uneven, because he'd been learning when he made it. She remembered him making it, the winter of 2003, sitting at this workbench, practicing the carving on scrap wood first. She stood with the box in her hands. She looked at the pegboard, at the shadow outlines of the tools still hanging, at the two blank spaces where the hammer and level had been. She went upstairs. She was almost to the door when she turned back. She was carrying the wooden box toward the stairs when she noticed the wall. North side of the basement, behind where the old shelving unit had stood. The shelving unit was gone now. She'd had it removed on day 3, and the wall behind it was visible for the first time in years. The plaster was slightly different. A section, roughly 18 inches by 12, where the texture didn't quite match, where someone had patched, sometime in the past, with slightly different material. Someone who was trying to make it blend, but who was not, in the end, a plasterer. Ellen stood and looked at it for a long time. She pressed her palm flat against it. She thought about Thomas's voice. The house remembers everything you put into it. She had 11 boxes packed and a rental car arriving in 4 hours. She took her hand off the wall. She went upstairs. She told herself she'd imagined it. The rental apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 6 blocks from Dorothy's house, which was the only thing she'd asked for when Richard found it. 2 rooms. A window that faced west, which meant no morning light. A kitchen with a counter she didn't recognize, and a coffee maker that took capsules she hadn't bought yet. She put Thomas's hammer on the windowsill. She put the wooden drill bit box next to it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boxes she hadn't unpacked, and the walls that weren't her walls, and the window facing the wrong direction. And she thought, this is what 4 months looks like. She called Dorothy that night. Dorothy talked for 40 minutes, which was what Dorothy always did. And Ellen let her, which was what Ellen always did. And somewhere in the middle of it, she stopped feeling quite so much like she was underwater. She did not call her sons. On the second morning, she drove past Birchwood Lane. She hadn't planned to. She'd been going to the pharmacy, and the route took her within 2 blocks. And then she was on the street without having decided to be. The house was still standing. Barely. The front had been opened, a section of the facade pulled away, the interior visible, the way the inside of a body is visible when something is removed. A dumpster sat at the curb. A generator ran. 2 men in hard hats moved in the upper rooms. She stopped the car. She watched for 7 minutes. She counted. Then she drove to the pharmacy. The third morning, the phone rang. She'd been awake since 4:30. The west-facing window, let in a quality of early light she hadn't learned to sleep through yet. She was sitting at the kitchen counter with coffee she'd made in the capsule machine, which she had in the end purchased because you have to start somewhere. The number wasn't saved. Area code she didn't recognize. She answered. "Mrs. Calloway?" The careful voice. "My name is Ray Dominguez. I'm the site foreman on the Meadowfield job, the house on Birchwood." She set down the coffee cup. "We found something inside the walls," he said. "I think it belongs to you. I'd like it if you could come by, if you're able. There's no rush, but I think you should see it yourself." She was already standing up. If you're still here, subscribe. This is the kind of story we tell. Every week, one more. Ray Dominguez was a large man, somewhere in his late 50s, with a face that suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors, and a way of moving through the demolition site that made it clear he knew exactly what was under every board. He met her at the edge of the lot, which was all that was left of the yard, and walked her in with a kind of care that Ellen noticed. The way he said, "Watch your step," before the places where the ground was uneven. The way he held back a piece of plastic sheeting so she could pass without touching it. The house was mostly framing now. The rooms she had lived in for 44 years reduced to their bones. The geometry of the structure visible without the walls. The way a face changes when you understand its structure. She could see the place where the kitchen had been, the angle of the light coming through the space where the east window had stood. She kept walking. He led her to the north side of the basement. The plaster was open now. The section she had noticed, the patch that didn't match, pulled back to reveal the cavity behind. And in the cavity, a metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox. Dark grey, with a simple latch, sealed against the plaster with a thin bead of cork that had dried and held for however long it had been there. The box sat on a folding table Ray had set up near the opening. Ellen looked at it. "The cork on this section is newer than the surrounding material by 25 years, Ray said. "Whoever put it in knew what they were doing, framing-wise. But the plaster finish is an amateur job. Someone who was careful, but not a tradesman." Thomas had been careful. He had not been a tradesman. She picked up the box. The latch opened on the first try. Inside, a white envelope, unsealed. Her name written on the front in handwriting she would have recognized in any context, in any light, in any condition. Thomas's handwriting, the slightly forward lean, the T that always came out larger than the other letters. Below the envelope, a photograph. Them, in the kitchen, the first year in the house. She was 29. He was 31. They were both laughing at something outside the frame. She didn't remember what. Below the photograph, a folded document, official paper, notarized. A parcel of land, Lake County, recorded in her name. Ellen May Calloway, not Ellen Calloway, not the Calloway Family Trust. Her name, alone. The way you write a name when you want it to mean exactly one person. And beneath the document, a key. Plain, brass, the kind hardware stores cut for you in a minute while you wait. She opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, both sides. The date at the top was October 14th, 3 weeks before he died. She understood, reading the date, that he had known something was coming, even if he hadn't said it. He had always been better than her at looking at difficult things directly. The letter began, "If someone found this, it means the house is gone. But you're still here. And that's the only thing that ever mattered." Ellen stood in the open frame of the basement of the house on Birchwood Lane, the house she had lived in for 44 years, the house that was now beams and light and the memory of rooms. And she read. Ray Dominguez and his crew moved to the other end of the site. They gave her time. She read all 4 pages. She read some of them twice. She read one paragraph, the 3rd page, 2nd paragraph, 3 times, standing still, until she had it somewhere other than her eyes. He wrote about the land at the lake, how he'd bought it 9 years ago, with money he'd saved out of his pension. Not hidden from her, just saved separately because he'd wanted it to be a gift and not a decision. How he'd spent the last 4 years building the cabin himself, on weekends, telling her he was going fishing, which he also was, because the lake was right there. How the key in the envelope opened the front door. He wrote, "I always thought we'd go there together. I'm sorry we don't get to. I want you to have somewhere that is only yours. Not ours, not theirs, yours. I want you to know that I thought about you every board I laid." He wrote other things too, personal things, the kind of things you write when you understand you may not get another chance to say them. She read those parts only once. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her coat pocket. She looked up. The sky above the open frame was the particular blue of late autumn, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it, but a great deal of clarity. A sparrow landed on a beam and looked at her and left. "Mrs. Calloway." Ray was beside her. She hadn't heard him come back. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. She meant it. Lake County was 2 hours north. She drove there on a Friday, alone, with the key in her coat pocket and the document in her bag, and the photograph on the passenger seat. The land was at the end of a gravel road that ran along the eastern shore. 6 acres, a dock that needed work, a stand of white birch along the north edge that she could already imagine in every season, the way birch looks in snow, in April mud, in the full green of July. The cabin sat back from the water, small, 1 large room with a sleeping loft, a kitchen along one wall, a wood stove in the corner. Thomas had built it with the same approach he brought to everything, careful, unhurried, willing to do something over if it wasn't right. The walls were straight, the floor was level, the wood stove had paper and kindling already laid inside it, ready to light, the way you lay a fire when you don't know exactly when someone is coming, but you want them to be warm when they do. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, the window that faced east, she noticed, the same as Birchwood, the same morning light. He had left a coffee cup, clean, turned right side up, as if he'd been expecting her. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. The lake was visible through the east window, a long silver distance under November light. A dock extended from the bank, the far end dark with water. A row of birch trees ran along the north edge of the property, white and thin, their leaves gone, their branches making a fine pattern against the sky. She thought about him here, by himself on a weekend, nailing boards, making it right, going back over things that weren't level, and making them level. Because that was what he did, because that was who he had always been. A man who looked at a thing until he understood what it needed, and then gave it that. She went in. She stood in the center of the room for a moment without moving, the way you stand in a new place before you start to understand it. Then she went to the east window. She looked out at the water. She put her hand on the coffee cup, still smooth, still his. She sat at the small table by the window and looked at the lake and listened to the particular silence of a place that has been waiting, not empty, not abandoned, but waiting. The way a room feels when someone who loved it has only just left. She stayed until the light changed. Richard called on a Wednesday, 10 days later. The lawyer had found the parcel in the county records during a routine title review. He called Richard. Richard called Paul. Paul was the one who actually dialed her number. She'd expected that. She let it ring once, picked up. Paul said her name. Then he said they'd found out about the property. Then he started to say something about the estate, about what Thomas would have wanted, about family. She let him finish. "Your father left it to me," she said. "Not to us, to me." A pause. "Mom." "I'll talk to you both when you're ready to talk about the house," she said. "Not before." She hung up. She was sitting at the table by the east window. The lake was grey that morning, the surface textured by wind. A heron stood at the end of the dock with the absolute stillness of something that has learned how to wait. She watched it for a long time. Dorothy came up in November. She arrived with soup, of course, and an overnight bag, and the kind of energy that fills rooms, whether or not rooms are ready for it. She stood on the porch and looked at the water and said, "Ellen, my God." "I know," Ellen said. They ate soup at the small table by the window. Dorothy asked her everything, the whole story, start to end. And Ellen told her, the way you tell things to someone who has been bringing you soup for 15 years and has earned the full version. Dorothy cried at the letter, which Ellen had expected, and laughed at the rubber bands, which Ellen had also expected. "He built you an escape hatch," Dorothy said. "He built me a home," Ellen said. Dorothy thought about this. "Both," she said. Ellen looked at the window. The morning light was coming in exactly the way it had on Birchwood. She had noticed this on the first morning and had understood then that he'd done it on purpose. Found the same angle, the same east-facing window, the same quality of light she had stood in since 1979. He had been building her a way out for years. He just never told her she might need it. The metal box sat on the windowsill in the cabin, next to Thomas's hammer, next to the wooden drill bit box with his initials on the lid. 3 things from the house on Birchwood Lane, in a house that was only hers, on a lake where the herons stood still on the dock in the early morning, and the birch trees ran along the north edge, and the light came in from the east the same way it always had. Did her sons ever apologize? Did she ever let them see the lake? And what else did Thomas leave? In the walls, in the years, in the life they built together, in the places she hadn't thought to look yet. She was going to find out. She had time. Subscribe, because every story like this one deserves to be heard. And there's another one coming. Ellen's sons sold the family home without telling her. Signed the paperwork using a power of attorney she'd given them for taxes. Gave her 2 weeks to pack 44 years. On the 3rd morning in her rental apartment, before she'd unpacked, before she'd called them back, before she decided what came next, a stranger called from an area code she didn't recognize. He was the foreman, tearing down her house. He said they'd found something inside the walls. What Thomas had left there, sealed in plaster, waiting, is the part of this story that stays with you.